I've had occasion to say many times in my programs that I can only report the news as it is at the time when the program is made, and that sometimes events will take place between the time when my program is made and the moment when it is published. And by the time it is published, some of the things I have said at the time of the program are out of date. Well, yesterday was a classic example. When I made my video, the program, there was still fighting, or at least the reports were suggesting that there was still fighting going on in Bakhmut, that the fighting there was unresolved, that there were still some small buildings, isolated buildings, yet to be captured. One particular building in particular, an apartment complex known as the Airplane, apparently was still being fought over. And then sometime after I made my program, we got an announcement, a characteristically prickly announcement from Prigozhin, announcing that Bakhmut had been completely captured and that it had been completely cleared of all Ukrainian defenders. And of course, being Prigozhin, he went out of his way to say that the Bakhmut had been liberated entirely and exclusively by the fighters of the Wagner organization. And he went on to say that they fought both the Ukrainian army and the Russian military bureaucrats who were putting sticks in their wheels. And he named specifically Defense Minister Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Gerasimov, and went out of his way to say that the losses, the casualties amongst the Wagner organization were 5 times greater than they would have been had it not been for their sabotage and interference, or as he put it, because of their whims. He did, however, go out of his way to make it clear that his strictures do not extend to President Putin himself or to Surovikin, General Surovikin, who, as I said, I believe to be the overall theatre commander, and General Mizintsev, General Staff Officer, who was recently appointed to be deputy head of the Wagner organization and who is its actual chief. At least that is my own personal view. Anyway, Prigozhin also said that the Wagner organization would ensure that the Bakhmut was secured, it would create defense lines there, but that it would finally withdraw from Bakhmut on the 25th of May, which is to say in just a few days, and then it would retire to the rear, where it would reorganize, rest, and refit. And on that topic, I should say that I've had more information from that invaluable source close to the Wagner organization, but not, I want to stress, a part of the Wagner organization. This person has suggested that the Wagner organization will indeed be reorganized and in some ways enlarged, obviously not by Prigozhin himself, but by the 2 agencies that control it, the Military Intelligence Agency of the General Staff, the GRU, and of course the other agency that deals with internal security, which for various reasons I've decided not to identify in these programs. And I gather that the plan now is to make the Wagner organization a rather more sophisticated unit, a rather more complex unit than it is at the moment, to give it at least a motorized element. Essentially, at the moment, it is a light infantry force backed by artillery. It does have its own organic artillery, but essentially it is a light infantry force. It also operates drones and such things. But apparently there's now intentions to provide Wagner with some armoured vehicles and to make it a rather more, shall I say, heavy unit than it's been up to now. I don't mean to suggest, by the way, that the plan is to turn it into mechanized brigade with tracked vehicles and tanks. I think that might actually go against its purpose, which, as I've said on many occasions, is to extend Russia's reach around the world in a way that provides Russia with a degree of deniability. That's how it's been used in places like Syria, Africa, such places. And I doubt, as I said, that it will be provided with tanks and tracked vehicles. That would make it too much like a regular Russian military unit. But it could be provided with armoured vehicles, wheeled vehicles, that would be suitable for operation over long distances, savanna or desert country or such things. The Russians have recently been working hard to develop a family of wheeled vehicles called Boomerang, a bit like the American Striker, but there are apparently some differences. And that might be a possible fit for Wagner in the future. Anyway, just saying. So that report came out. It said that was a report from Prigozhin. He said that Bakhmut had indeed been taken. And further reports started to circulate in the hours that followed, which largely confirmed that. These were reports from embedded Russian journalists who are part of the Wagner force and the Russian military in this conflict, and they were coming back and they were providing reports which were appearing in all the Russian telegram channels and indeed on Russian media, which were confirming the accuracy of what Prigozhin was saying. Now, I made certain comments about Prigozhin. I said that sometimes he says things that perhaps one shouldn't take entirely seriously. But I want to repeat something I have said before. I have never known him to say that the Wagner organization has captured a village, settlement, hamlet, town, which it has not in fact captured. So, as far as I'm concerned, a statement from Prigozhin that the Wagner organization has fully captured Bakhmut is something you can bank. I just want to make that absolutely clear. Anyway, a couple of hours later, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed what Prigozhin was saying. At least they published an announcement which appeared to confirm what Prigozhin was saying. And it was typically extremely terse. This is, by the way, characteristic of the information the Russian Defense Ministry provides, and is not open for discussion or comment, and certainly not for questions. And it appeared firstly on the Defense Ministry's Telegram channel, and it said in the Artyomovsk tactical direction, Artyomovsk, of course, is the Russian name for Bakhmut, which, following this video, is the name I will henceforth use to describe this town. In the Artyomovsk tactical direction, the assault units teams of the Wagner private military company, with the support of artillery and aviation of the Southern Battle Group, has completed the liberation of the city of Artyomovsk. Now, putting aside issues of, the name of the place, Artyomovsk to the Russians, Bakhmut to the Ukrainians, putting aside also the question of whether Artyomovsk has in fact been liberated. Russians overwhelmingly think so. There is, of course, in this statement, two rather interesting points. Firstly, a recognition of the role played by the Wagner organization. The Russian Ministry of Defense tends to avoid referring to it by name, but on this occasion it did. It said that the assault teams of the Wagner military company have completed the liberation of the city of Artyomovsk. So it made it absolutely clear that it was the Wagner organization, its fighters, that did the fighting in Artyomovsk. But, and this comes back to what Prigozhin has been saying, Prigozhin says that they did it all by themselves. The Russian Ministry of Defense begs to disagree. They did it with the support of artillery and aviation of the Southern Battle Group, of the Yug Battle Group. And of course, on this, let's just be absolutely clear about this, the Russian Defense Ministry is right. The claims that some people are making that it is Wagner and Wagner alone that has been waging this war on behalf of Russia on the battlefronts is manifestly wrong. Wagner does not have the resources as a private military company to take on a Ukrainian army that numbers between 400,000 and 700,000 men, depending on how you count it. And obviously, it could not have captured a place like Bakhmut without the support of the regular Russian military. Prigozhin might want everybody to think otherwise, but that is the reality. And in fact, and this is an important thing again to say, if the Ukrainians are telling the truth, if Russian artillery strikes in the Bakhmut area were in the region of 25 to 30,000 rounds a day, then the bombardment that was taking place, the artillery bombardment that was taking place in and around Bakhmut by the Russian army was on a huge scale, far exceeding anything that the Wagner military company by itself could have done, given that it exceeds the total amount of artillery firings carried out by the 100,000 plus Ukrainian army right across the contact line. So this is just to clarify this. There's no doubt at all that the Russian regular military were involved. There's also no doubt at all, by the way, that the Russian Air Force has also been involved. Glide bombs and such things have definitely been used to strike positions within Bakhmut itself, Ukrainian positions within Bakhmut itself, and it is only the Russian regular army which is in possession of these. However, that does not in any way detract from the extraordinary success of the Wagner organization taking on the Ukrainian military in a strongly fortified position, which was Bakhmut, and prevailing against them, despite the fact that there is good reason to think that in Bakhmut itself and in the various places around, the Ukrainians probably had, for much of the battle at least, a numerical superiority. So that's what I would say about the Russian Ministry of Defense's announcement. And then there was a further announcement, a further statement from no less a person than President Putin himself. Vladimir Putin himself made a statement, and it has appeared on the Kremlin's website. And it reads as follows. The President congratulated the Wagner assault forces, as well as all service personnel of the Russian armed forces, who had rendered them the required support and protected the flanks on the completion of the operation to liberate Artyomovsk. All military personnel who distinguished themselves in the operation will be recommended for state decorations. Now, that is a very interesting statement, and interesting for its political elements, and I will just explain what those are. Firstly, note that Putin congratulates the Wagner assault unit. So again, recognition from the President, the Supreme Commander, of the role that Wagner has played in liberating Artyomovsk, as the Russians call it. But notice that this statement does not refer to Prigozhin by name. He's not mentioned here. Of course, the Defense Ministry, doesn't mention Prigozhin by name either, but neither, so it turns out, does Putin. And of course, Putin is the political chief. And Putin also pointedly congratulates, after he's congratulated the Wagner forces, he also congratulates the service personnel of the Russian Federation Armed Forces, in other words, the regular military, who rendered the Wagner forces support and protected the flanks on the completion of the operation to liberate Artyomovsk. So again, Putin is making it very clear that no, it wasn't just Wagner. This was a team effort. Wagner was an indispensable key part of the team, but it did not act alone. And then the real twist in the knife, in my opinion, is in the last paragraph. All military personnel who distinguished themselves in the operation will be recommended for state decorations. Note the careful insertion of the word military personnel. Prigozhin, of course, is not a military person. He's not a soldier. He's not an officer. He doesn't command the Wagner organization. He is a civilian. He is its titular chief and nominal owner, but he is not a military person. And he will not be recommended, that's my take of this, for state decorations. Whether or not Prigozhin realizes this, he's turned the entire political and military leadership of the Russian government against him, and I don't think there's any coming back. At some point, they will maneuver to ensure that he doesn't get the kind of coverage and attention that he has over the last few weeks in this fight for Bakhmut. Now, I say all of that because I do know that there is a very widespread prevailing view that this entire quarrel between the Defense Ministry and Prigozhin was a piece of theatre, a trap intended to make the Ukrainians think that the situation in Bakhmut was disintegrating, that the Russian position was weakening, that there was enormous acrimony and disagreement between the Russians, and that this was intended to lure the Ukrainians into this trap where they would be defeated and destroyed. I'm very sorry to say that I think that is almost certainly wrong. I've been listening to Prigozhin's comments. I've been watching his videos, difficult though these sometimes are, to follow, especially given the fact, and I want to reiterate this again, because I have a great deal of sympathy and some respect for him. But anyway, the fact is, I have no doubt that this argument and quarrel is for real, and look at the fact that even in his final announcement of the capture of Bakhmut, he still has a swipe at Shoigu and Gerasimov, the defense minister and the chief of general staff, even after Bakhmut has been captured, and even after whatever ploy might have existed to lure the Ukrainians into fighting in Bakhmut had exhausted its purpose. So I'm afraid I think this quarrel is all too real. It is extremely unfortunate, to put it mildly, from a Russian point of view. I don't know what effect it's had on morale. Certainly it doesn't seem to have affected the effectiveness of the Wagner fighters on the ground, which makes me rather think that, in fact, most of them are indeed tough-minded, strong-minded professionals commanded by professional officers who perhaps don't take Prigozhin entirely seriously. But one way or the other, this has been a disruptive and unfortunate accompaniment to this battle, and I'm afraid I take it I take it as real. Anyway, so those are the announcements from the Russians, and there's been a lot more pictures, photographs, films from Bakhmut, or Artyomovsk as I will now call it, showing Wagner fighters raising flags, including on the airplane building, which was the last big apartment complex controlled by Ukraine to be captured. I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that Bakhmut has indeed fallen. Now, I say that, and that unfortunately brings me to what I find a difficult subject, which is the way this has been covered in the British and Western media generally. Now, let me say first of all that in the hours, in fact minutes after Prigozhin's original statement, first statement, that Bakhmut had fallen, the Ukrainians rushed out denials. And I have to say, I found that both unsurprising and perhaps not just unsurprising, but it might have been the case, it might just possibly have been the case, that the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev were simply reporting what they believed they knew. The situation, as I said, was extremely fluid. The very last reports before Prigozhin made his statement was that there was still intense fighting going on in certain buildings, and that the Ukrainian troops were still holding out in a small factory area, a small industrial area to the southwest of Bakhmut. And here they had Prigozhin coming along, making an announcement that Ukrainian resistance had completely collapsed. And it's perhaps unsurprising that initially they just found it impossible to believe. But then unfortunately, as the day has worn on, the Ukrainians persisted in their denials. And incredibly, for me, despite all these statements from Russian officials, despite the increasing amount of cinematic and the film and photograph evidence pouring out of Bakhmut, the media, especially in Britain, but also to a great extent in other places, took their cue from Ukraine. And we had a situation where briefly the media, at least in Britain, was reporting Prigozhin's statement that Bakhmut had fallen, whilst going out of their way to cast doubt on it and to highlight the Ukrainian denials. And then as the day wore on, I noticed that the whole story started to disappear from the front pages of the media, at least here in Britain. They were no longer reporting it to any great extent. At least the original stories were still there, but you had to go past the front page on the website to find them. And they talked about lots of other things, about the G7 meeting, Zelensky's presence there, the F-16 fighter saga, all of those things, but they stopped talking about Bakhmut. And then all sorts of confusion struck this morning, because this morning President Zelensky himself appeared to admit that Bakhmut had fallen in a discussion with President Biden. And this, of course, happened at the meeting, the G7 meeting in Hiroshima. He was apparently asked directly by President Biden, this comes from CNN, whether Bakhmut had fallen, or rather was still being, whether Ukraine still controlled Bakhmut. And he replied, I think not. And according to CNN, he went on to say, but you have to understand that there is nothing left there. It's a pity, it's a tragedy. But as of today, Bakhmut is only in our hearts. There is nothing in this place. Now that looks to me, and it did to many people, as effectively an admission that the Russians had indeed captured Bakhmut. And this didn't go down well. in Ukraine itself. Other Ukrainian officials started to dispute, or rather to contradict, what Zelensky had said. And sure enough, some hours later, in a press conference, Zelensky somewhat modified what he said. He now says that the Russians do not occupy Bakhmut, which is a very interesting choice of words. It's not, doesn't say that the Ukrainians control Bakhmut. It doesn't say that the Russians haven't captured Bakhmut. It says that they do not occupy Bakhmut. And he says also that one shouldn't read anything more into those words, those rather ambiguous and strange words, than their plain meaning. And of course, the media in the West, at least in Britain, has taken that as an outright denial that the Russians have captured Bakhmut. As I said, I find this all extraordinary. Again, perhaps the most, the best comment about this has been made by Mikael Valtersen, and he talks about the very similar coverage on Swedish media. And he says, he said this last night, I just listened to Swedish national radio and I could only stand it for 5 minutes. I was interested to hear what they said about Bakhmut. The host asked the correspondent in Ukraine, Prigozhin claims to have captured Bakhmut. Is that true? The correspondent answered, I doubt that. Ukraine has had successes in Bakhmut in the last weeks. And the Russians usually lie about things like this. And the Russians claim that they've captured Bakhmut before, which, by the way, they've never done. That's simply not the case. And then Valtersen quite correctly says that he just couldn't believe these comments like this. He says, do they know the force composition and where the different units are? Of course, the answer is no to all these questions. Why do they have all these military experts who don't know where different cities are along the front and only repeat Ukrainian numbers of Russian casualties like parrots? And that he's very disappointed because clearly it is possible to reconstruct, has been possible to reconstruct with a fair measure of accuracy what has been going on in Bakhmut. I've been doing it to the extent that I can by myself over the last couple of weeks, comparing the various reports from the various sides. It's been quite obvious who has been gaining ground. And of course, when I say from the various sides, I include the Ukrainian sides. Many Ukrainian reports about the fighting in Bakhmut have been important and interesting and true. And of course, most recently, in the last 2 weeks or so, I've had the enormous benefit of Mikael Valtersen himself, who's been doing all this hard work for me. But it's not just Valtersen, there's been others also. I mean, there's people like Simplicius the Thinker and Big Serge and all of these people. And of course, there's the various Telegram channels, and they'll be giving us a blow-by-blow account of what's been happening in Bakhmut, where the various movements of troops are, who's advancing, who's retreating, which buildings have been contested, what districts have fallen, all of those things. And if one had been paying attention, and these are big media organizations that we're talking about, not, as I said, small organizations like, well, this channel. If these big media organizations had devoted even a minuscule fraction of the resources that they possess, they would not have been surprised at all by the news that came through yesterday. Can I just say this? This type of coverage of this war is not helpful. It is not useful. It is creating within the West an echo chamber which is distorting profoundly understanding of the war. And given that I and many others have long since worked out, in fact, in my case, I actually know that the major source of information about what is going on in any particular battlefield or war zone, that politicians and policymakers in the West rely upon is the news media, the mainstream news media, you can understand why they are making the catastrophic mistakes that they are repeatedly and continuously making. Why they're making mistakes and making judgments and saying things which have absolutely no connection to reality. The function of the media is to inform, and of course informing does involve commentary, but commentary does require, accurate commentary does require at least a serious effort to ascertain the facts. And clearly, we have not seen that over the last 2 days. As all of you will have realized, I'm choosing my words very carefully. I could have expressed myself much more strongly. But anyway, so Bakhmut has fallen. That, to my mind, there is no doubt. Where do we go from here? First thing to say is that though Bakhmut has fallen, that does not necessarily mean that the battle, the fighting in this area has ended. Over the last couple of days, weeks, in fact, we've had a fairly serious Ukrainian counterattack on the flanks. It doesn't seem to have made any progress. As of yesterday, despite an earlier claim by Prigozhin, it appears that the village of Sako and Vanseti, for example, tiny place that it is, inconsequential in the broader scheme of things, but far away also, or by some measures, far away from the particular point of this battle, from Bakhmut itself, Sako and Vanseti remains in Russian hands. And the Ukrainians have suffered very heavy losses to try to roll up the flanks. The Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine, who I get the sense is not actually, she seems to be a civilian and doesn't seem to be very well informed about things. Anyway, she's talking about Ukraine having Bakhmut in a semicircle. This is, again, totally detached from reality on any basis, on any understanding of what is actually going on in and around the town. But anyway, all of that whole offensive seems to have been a miserable failure up to this point. But that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are just going to give up on it. Some of their comments about Bakhmut suggest that they know that it has indeed been captured by the Russians. It's now acquired a symbolic importance that transcends its very real strategic significance. It's not inconceivable that at some point over the next few days we might see a Ukrainian counterattack to try to recapture it. Unlikely, though, I have to say that seems to me at the moment. And we're getting lots of reports now, by the way, that the Russians are sending reinforcements increasingly to this area. And we've seen the Russian artillery now operating to deadly effect in and around Bakhmut. And the Russian Air Force is operating to deadly effect in and around Bakhmut. And I suspect that any attempt by Ukraine to recapture Bakhmut will not only fail, but fail disastrously, with many, many more people, many more Ukrainian soldiers killed to no purpose. So that's one thing one has to say. But to reiterate again, it seems to me that this fight in and around Bakhmut is not over. It's not ended yet, and it is not impossible that Ukraine itself might conduct some kind of an offensive here. But what about the possibilities that the Russians themselves could conduct an offensive? And I'm going to say that there are reports that the Ukrainian forces are now withdrawing to Chasov Yar. They're not, in fact, pressing forward with this offensive at all. There's also a very, very unreliable report that Khromovo, one of the villages close to Bakhmut, has also been captured by the Russians. But it's clear that Ivanivska, bigger village to the southwest of Bakhmut, remains under Ukrainian control. And it's been suggested that Ivanivska is the place where the Ukrainians will next make their stand. It lies on the road to Chasov Yar. Chasov Yar itself is apparently not very defendable. Ivanivska is, because supposedly it is surrounded by heavy woods, which provide good cover for the defenders. And this is the reason why repeated attempts by the Russians up to now have not succeeded in capturing this place. So it could be that we will see a Russian offensive. It could be an offensive directed at Ivanivska, intended to capture Chasov Yar. It could be that the Russians will also advance in the north, take Khromovo. If they haven't actually already captured Khromovo, it could be that they will do all kinds of other things in this particular area. And there's also suggestions that the Russians might pull forward and now finally resolve that unresolved problem from last year, which is the problem of Siversk. Siversk was a town some distance north from Bakhmut, and indeed Soledar. Siversk is the northern end of the so-called Zelensky line. It was widely expected after the capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk by the Russian military last year that the Russians would make an attempt to capture Siversk. Officials of the Lugansk regional government twice announced that Siversk had in fact been captured, when it turned out that was not the case, and in fact that part of the front line has stagnated. The Russians have never made any serious attempt to capture Siversk. And though I'm no sort of expert at all in these matters, I will say that I've heard suggestions that it was the failure to capture Siversk that was, to some extent at least, responsible for the operational crisis the Russians suffered at the time of the Kharkov counteroffensive by Ukraine last autumn. That the fact that the Ukrainians were still in possession of Siversk made it possible for Ukraine to penetrate Russian defenses more easily, to retake Liman, to put pressure on the Lugansk region, territory now of the Lugansk People's Republic, part of Russia, according to the Russians, that this failure to settle the problem of Siversk was what caused the Russians a lot of problems in the autumn. And if that is correct, then capturing Siversk ought to be a priority, and presumably recapturing Liman too, and perhaps Kupiansk, and finally and conclusively stabilizing the situation along the Oskol River line. And of course, the capture of Chasov Yar, the capture of these other villages close to Bakhmut, Bogdanova, Ivanivska, Khromovo, all of these places would enable the Russians to create a stable, consolidated defense line, which could then be used as a future launch point for further advances westwards towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, the last important cities controlled by Ukraine in northern and central Donbass. Well, we'll see what the Russians do. As I said, I suspect that they will want to sort out the issue of these villages around Bakhmut, Khromovo, Bogdanovka, probably Ivanivska as well, if only to consolidate their control of Bakhmut. Once they've done that, we'll see what they do. But in the meantime, we also have the tantalizing, unresolved mystery of what Ukraine intends to do, assuming that it doesn't conduct this offensive around Bakhmut that we've been hearing so much about, that this offensive has indeed actually and truly been called off. Well, before I deal with that, I would say that we've had quite a lot of film published by Ukrainian soldiers as they pulled out of Bakhmut. It suggests that they were given an order to pull out of Bakhmut. So the suggestions that some have made, that part of the purpose of this offensive, Big Serge in particular, was to open the roads briefly to allow the Ukrainian soldiers to pull out. May be true. But anyway, they pulled back. What do they intend to do? They've preserved some of their forces. They might go on the attack. They might try and establish a defense line, as I said, in Chasov Yar, or perhaps more logically in Ivanivska. But will they launch this big offensive we have been hearing about? And are they going to do this anytime soon? And here again, I must say, I come back to this issue of the way in which this war has been covered by the media in the West, at least in Britain, because I've been discussing these huge Russian strikes on these big ammunition dumps, places like Melnitsky, Pavlograd, those kind of places. And again, this is not getting the kind of coverage that it ought to be getting. So we get lots of stories when a little, well, not a large, but not huge fuel dump or whatever is destroyed by the Ukrainians, through a drone attack or something like that, when a vast explosion of, colossal scale takes place in Khmelnytsky or Pavlograd. There's hardly a word about it. And that, of course, again, creates a very distorted picture about what is going on. But if, of course, Ukraine is losing large amounts of ammunition, equipment, material, men in all of these attacks, well, perhaps that is causing Ukraine to put off its offensive. And that might be an issue that Ukraine has. Who's to know? Without proper reporting, it's impossible to get a correct picture, make a proper assessment of what's happening. And of course, we also come back to the situation with casualties. Now, this is an extremely fraught affair. I'm going to say straight away that every claim made in the West about Russian casualties is, in my opinion, inflated to the point of absurdity. The issue of Ukrainian casualties is acknowledged from time to time, but never addressed properly and regularly discounted. There's been, however, some commentary, mostly Russian, but it seems fairly well founded, that there has been a huge spike in Ukrainian losses since the start of the year, that the Bakhmut meat grinder, to use that ghastly expression, but apparently it is the actual operational title for the operation that the Russian military carried out in Bakhmut. Apparently it was referred to as Operation Bakhmut Meat Grinder, which is rather extraordinary, but there we go. Anyway, it seems to have had its effect. And there's been suggestions from Russian sources that Ukrainian casualties since the start of the year, and I mean deaths, have been in excess of 10,000 a month. I don't know whether that is true, but that there has been a serious uptick in Ukrainian losses. There was a big spike in the early autumn during the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives, and things began to calm a little for a few weeks. And then since the start of the year, apparently there's been another spike again. What implications does this all have? And of course, there are also the swirling rumours about what's happened to Ukraine's military leadership. There's constant rumours about General Zaluzhny and General Syrskyi. There's claims that General Zaluzhny, at least, has been severely wounded in a missile strike. Some say in Pavlograd, others say in Dnipro. That he's had surgery, that he's no longer really fit to command. I don't have any evidence to support that, none at all. And in fact, there's reports that he spoke to General Milley, the chief of the US, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, a few days ago. So I don't personally think that General Zaluzhny has been severely wounded. I don't think that General Syrskyi has been severely wounded. But I know lots of other people who think that they have been. And this story that they have both been severely wounded is starting to gain traction. And of course, Zelensky himself is away. He's now away from Kiev most of the time, as far as I can see. So what exactly is happening? What kind of decisions are being made? What kind of planning is taking place in Kiev? At the moment, it's very difficult to say. Anyway, one point I will make is this. Russian commentaries following the capture of Bakhmut have been decidedly not triumphalist. The Russians seem to understand that they have a difficult struggle still ahead of them. They won an important battle. There's much comment about the fact that Bakhmut was captured on the 20th of May, that on the 20th of May last year, the liberation, as the Russians would say, of Mariupol took place, and also some points that Zelensky's own inauguration, or perhaps it was election as president of Ukraine, was also on the 20th of May, the 20th of May 2019. Anyway, just saying that. But anyway, the point is, apparently, Bakhmut has been captured, but the Russians are not fooling themselves that this war is over. And in fact, there's been comments by senior Russian commanders, Alexander Khodorkovsky, for example, who heads the Vostok Brigade, which is one of the toughest brigades of the Donetsk militia. He said that he thinks that Ukraine is now going to launch its Zaporozhye offensive any day now, if only in order to distract attention from what has happened in Bakhmut. Vladimir Rogov and others have been saying that Ukraine has gathered a force of 65,000 men in this area and that they're ready to launch this offensive, that this offensive could happen any day now. It was prepared for the moment when Bakhmut fell, and Bakhmut has now fallen, and it's about to happen, and that means that there's going to be a big intensification of the war at this point. Well, all of this may be true, but I mean, we'll just have to wait and see. The fall of Bakhmut is important. It has undoubtedly caused Ukraine to suffer extremely severe losses. It was apparently launched, properly speaking, by General Surovikin in October. Certainly, the Wagner organization forces came close to Bakhmut around the middle of May last year, but as I said, they remained relatively idle for many months close to Bakhmut. But as I said, the active part of the war, of the battle for Bakhmut, began following instructions from General Surovikin in October. And Surovikin apparently instructed the Wagner forces to launch this offensive in Bakhmut, to lure the Ukrainian troops into Bakhmut, because Bakhmut was this strategic location. It was this transportation hub in the Donbass. It tied together the Ukrainian defenses of the Donbass. And Surovikin calculated correctly that for that reason the Ukrainians would defend it. And Surovikin's plan, apparently, we have this from Prigozhin and from various others, was not so much to capture Bakhmut as to buy the Russians time. They just dealt with the Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region. They needed to fortify their lines. They needed to ensure that Ukraine did not immediately launch its Zaporozhye offensive as it had planned to do directly after the end of the Kherson offensive. And so it was principally and foremost an exercise in weakening the Ukrainian army, diverting it from the Zaporozhye region, causing it to suffer very, very heavy losses in Bakhmut, whilst the Russian army re-equipped, reorganized, refitted, absorbed all the hundreds of thousands of reservists that were pouring in and joining it, and prepared for the next round. And of course, this has turned out better than Surovikin intended, because of course Ukraine did exactly what he planned. They did continue to pour thousands upon thousands of men into Bakhmut. On the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I have discussed this at length. Our bewilderment, our bafflement that Ukraine would go on doing this would be reinforcing failure, reinforcing loss by clinging on to Bakhmut in the way that they were doing. I've said this many times on this channel, but that's what Ukraine did. It played directly into Surovikin's hands. And not only did Ukraine do that, not only did it catastrophically overinvest in the defense of Bakhmut, it made it a symbolic resistance as well. So you had President Zelensky going to Congress in the United States, waving a flag to Congress signed by the defenders of Bakhmut, saying that Bakhmut would be where the tide of the war finally turned, spreading stories about Bakhmut being Ukraine's Stalingrad, that they would do to the Russians what the Russians themselves had done to the Germans in Stalingrad in the Second World War. There was a slogan, Bakhmut holds. Some people in Ukraine are still insisting that that is true, of course. And thousands of lives were lost like this, week after week, month after month, with hundreds of men sent into Bakhmut, reinforcing positions in Bakhmut, with levels of casualties that even the German intelligence agency, the BND, was saying ran into 3 figures every day. And this went on for weeks and months, absorbing Ukrainian manpower, absorbing some of Ukraine's best trained manpower, absorbing much of its equipment, resulting in the loss of officers and trained soldiers, resulting in massive expenditures by Ukraine of ammunition, of which it is desperately short, all to hold on to Bakhmut. So Surovikin got what he wanted in that respect, but he got even more, because I suspect someone, to his surprise, this has all ended, and he has Bakhmut. It seems Prigozhin has said as much, that the plan was not so much to capture Bakhmut, except, of course, at some point over the last few weeks, the plan changed when it became clear that Bakhmut might indeed be captured, and we know that the plan was finally decided, the decision was finally made to go all out and capture Bakhmut. And Bakhmut has indeed been captured. So Surovikin has bled the Ukrainians dry, as he intended. He's bought the Russians time. He's created all these intricate fortified lines. He's built up his forces and these Russian forces. He's got hundreds of thousands of men equipped and ready for the next round of the war. There's now increasing suggestions that the Russians clearly outnumber the Ukrainians on the battlefronts, that there's around 500,000 Russian troops facing off against a Ukrainian force of between 200 and 400,000 men, depending on how you count it. And he's also got Bakhmut. He's also got this key transportation hub, the one that tied together all the various Ukrainian defenses, a place so essential to the Ukrainian defenses that they had to defend it, which is why Surovikin attacked it in the way that he did, except probably back in October he didn't seriously intend to capture it, and now he has. So he now has a bigger success perhaps than he originally planned for. But he's got to deal with this offensive. And this offensive that the Ukrainians are talking about, and which will no doubt take place at some point in the next few hours or days or weeks. We shall see. My own sense is that one way or the other, this is a turning point in the war. When Zelensky said that it would be a turn in the tide, I think this is going to be a turn in the tide. I say that on the assumption, which I think is a reasonably safe assumption, that despite claims to the contrary, the Ukrainians are not going to be able to recapture Bakhmut, and this battle is indeed over, and that Bakhmut is once and for all now Artyomovsk. What has happened, however, is that as a result of all of this, the Russians are now ready for this Ukrainian offensive when it comes. They've built up their fortified lines. There's been a whole series of very interesting articles on the website of the Royal United Services Institute about the steady improvements in Russian tactics and Russian organization. There was an article from RUSI which got into the Daily Telegraph about how the Russians now have thousands of drones, reconnaissance drones, how they've integrated their reconnaissance and their fire control of their artillery, how they've computerized it, how even Russian troops at fairly small levels, small level of troops, now have strelets, computers, which enable them to work out how to launch accurate strikes on Ukrainian positions, saving artillery ammunition, by the way, and making those strikes more effective. RUSI has also been talking about how Russian small unit tactics have considerably improved over the last few months, how the Russians have broken free of some of the tactical rigidities of the battalion tactical group. This is a topic, by the way, that I'm not going to waste time on. I'm not the person to discuss it. You can find lots of other people, Brian Beletic, for example, who discusses the whole issue of the Russian battalion tactical group with far more skill than I can. But anyway, an overall picture of a much, much better organized better prepared, much bigger Russian army than that force which was rather hastily put together back in February last year when the Russians pushed into Ukraine, not so much, in my opinion, with any plan to conquer Ukraine, but rather to try to force Ukraine to come to some kind of political settlement, something that they very nearly pulled off, but which Boris Johnson and the Americans wrecked after it had nearly been achieved in Istanbul. So, in that respect, given that Bakhmut has made it possible for the Russians to achieve all that, I think it has been a turning of the tide. It's weakened Ukraine, it's allowed Russia on the battlefronts to get much stronger. And of course, there's the added bonus that the Russians now have Bakhmut. They have this logistics hub, this transportation hub. I understand that the key thing now will be to get the railway lines working again. If they can get the railway into Bakhmut operating from Russia itself, and remember all these railway lines were created during the period of the Soviet Union, so they do interconnect with cities in Russia, with Donetsk, of course, but also with Rostov and Voronezh, no doubt, and all of those. If they can build up the railway lines, then of course the Russians rely principally, as do the Ukrainians, by the way, on the railway system for their logistics, and they can start to move huge amounts of munitions, of fuel, of troops, of tanks, very quickly into this area in central Donbass, strategically located at the heart of what was once the Ukrainian defense system, able to launch attacks in all directions, putting the Russians in a position where they can break the Ukrainian defenses and capture Donbass once and for all. And once Donbass is captured, to my mind, in military terms, the war ends. Because, as several people have pointed out, between Donbass and the Dnieper, there are no real obstacles. And if the Russian army reaches the Dnieper in central Ukraine, then, in my opinion, based even on a cursory examination of the geography, it becomes clear that Ukraine is at that point in an existential crisis. So there we are. Victory for the Russians in Bakhmut. They're not letting it go to their head, which is wise. I think they're somewhat astonished themselves that they've achieved it. It was not perhaps part of their original plan. But there it is. That's what's happened. We'll see what Ukraine does. We'll see how the Western powers react once the reality of what has happened finally sinks in. But all of that, I'm afraid, I will have to discuss in my next program. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also do so by going to our shop. You can buy yourself the amazing things you'll find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you. Today, a historic day, and more from me soon.